She came to the town as a ghost would, a whisper of a woman carried on the dry autumn wind. Her presence was an unanswered question, a story half told, hanging in the dusty air like the scent of rain that never falls. A woman, pregnant and alone, feeding every orphan in a town that wished she'd never come. Her belly was a perfect taut sphere, a world of its own she carried before her, a shield against the sideways glances and the venomous whispers that coiled around her ankles like unseen snakes in the tall grass. They saw the swell of her stomach and saw only sin, a blatant walking testament to a fall from grace. They did not see the profound exhaustion in her eyes, a weariness that went deeper than her pregnancy, deeper than the miles she must have traveled to arrive at this forgotten outpost of judgment. They did not see the delicate tremble in her hands as she ladled thin but hot stew into the chipped bowls of children who had long ago forgotten the feeling of a full stomach. This was her ritual, her silent sermon on the edge of town, where the respectable world ended and the saint. Jude's home for the unwanted began. Every day at noon she would appear with a single heavy pot, its contents scraped together from what little she had, and she would feed them. The children, with their old eyes and hollow cheeks, saw her not as a sinner, but as a miracle. They called her the bread angel. To them, her approach was the only certainty in a life of unpredictable cruelties. But from the crest of the far hill, a man watched. He watched her every day. His name was Silas Blackwood, and he owned everything the sun touched in that valley, from the sprawling cattle ranch to the very ground beneath the town's feet. He was a man carved from hardship, his face a roadmap of losses he never spoke of. He watched her not with the lust or pity of other men, but with a cold, calculating intensity. He saw the gentle way she wiped a smudge from a little girl's cheek, and his jaw would tighten. He saw the soft smile she gave a boy who had finally spoken a word after months of silence, and a shadow would pass over his features, dark and menacing. He saw a performance, a carefully constructed facade of sainthood designed to hide something rotten beneath. He was a man who believed that every good deed was a mask for a dark secret, and he was determined to rip hers away. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments where are you watching from, and subscribe if you want more content like this one. The world seemed to hold its breath when she was near. The dust motes in the sunbeams of the orphanage's dilapidated porch would hang suspended, listening. The children would fall silent, their usual cacophony of small griefs and smaller joys hushed by the quiet gravity of her presence. Ilara moved with the deliberation of someone conserving a finite and precious supply of energy. Each step, each dip of the ladle, each word she spoke was measured. She was a fortress, and her silence was the high wall she had built around herself. She never spoke of where she came from, or of the man who had left her with this sacred, heavy burden. Her past was a locked room, and she carried the only key, swallowed deep inside her. The townspeople, who thrived on the currency of gossip, found her silence infuriating. It was an affront to their unwritten laws of communal knowledge. A woman in her condition owed them a story, a tearful confession they could dissect and judge over their fences and teacups. Her refusal to provide one was an act of defiance they could not forgive. She endured their judgment, as a tree endures the wind, bending, but never breaking. She would walk past the mercantile, her gaze fixed on a point far beyond the horizon, ignoring the way conversations would halt and then resume in sharp, sibilant whispers the moment she had passed. "Shameless," the baker's wife would mutter, her hands covered in flour as if her own virtue were as pure and white. "Someone ought to do something," the sheriff would say, polishing a badge that represented an order she so clearly disrupted. But no one ever did anything, because her crime was intangible, a thing of perception, and her punishment was the isolation she seemed to have already chosen for herself. Her days were a study in repetition. Rise before the sun, work for 2 hours mending clothes for a small pittance from a farmer's wife on the outskirts of town, use the coins to buy potatoes and carrots, make the stew, and walk the mile to St. Jude's. It was a life stripped to its barest essentials, survival and service. But this service was her secret penance. For what, no one knew. She was atoning for a sin far greater than the one the town accused her of. She was atoning for a memory, for a love so fierce it had burned her life to the ground, leaving only this single desperate purpose in its ashes: And as the sun began to dip low, casting long, skeletal shadows across the valley, Silas Blackwood would stand on his porch, the vast, empty expanse of his ranch house behind him, a testament to his own hollowed-out existence. He'd watch her small figure retreat from the orphanage, a solitary silhouette against the bleeding sky, and the ice in his heart would harden, certain that her secrets and his were somehow intertwined, destined to collide. The silence of Silas Blackwood's life was a palpable thing. It lived in the vast, dust-sheeted rooms of his mansion, a house built for a dynasty he would never have. It echoed in the empty chair across his dinner table, and in the space beside him in his bed. He had filled the void not with companionship, but with land, with cattle, with power. Power was a comfort. It was predictable, and it obeyed his will. People did not, especially not women with secrets in their eyes. One afternoon, he descended from his hill. His polished boots crunched on the gravel path leading to the orphanage, a sound as out of place as a gunshot in a church. Alara was just finishing packing her empty pot. The children scattered like quail as he approached, sensing the cold authority that radiated from him. He stopped a few feet from her, his shadow falling over her. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, his presence consuming the air. "You're the one feeding them," he said. It wasn't a question. His voice was low, rough, like stones grinding together. Alara looked up, her expression unreadable. She simply nodded, her hand resting instinctively on her stomach. "They need it," she said, her voice quiet but clear, without a trace of the deference he was used to. "I'm Silas Blackwood," he stated, as if the name itself should be enough to intimidate her. She did not react. "I know," she replied. He studied her, his eyes narrowed, searching for a flicker of fear, of recognition, of guilt. He found nothing but a profound, weary calm. "Where do you get the money for the food?" he pressed, his tone edging into an interrogation. "I earn it." "Doing what?" "Mending." The conversation was a chess match, each move spare and calculated. He felt a surge of frustration. He was used to people crumbling under his scrutiny, eager to please, to offer up any information he desired. This woman, this pregnant waif, gave him nothing. He reached into his coat and pulled out a thick roll of bills, held together by a leather strap. "I'll give you $500, he said, the words sharp, "for the children, so you don't have to mend." The offer hung in the air, a poisoned piece of fruit. It was a test, a way to see if she could be bought, if her saintly act had a price. He wanted her to take it. It would confirm his darkest suspicions, that she was a grifter, a charlatan. Alara looked from the money to his face, and for the first time a spark of emotion showed in her eyes. Disdain. "They don't need your money," she said softly. "They need food, and they need to know someone cares. You can't buy that." She turned and walked away, leaving him standing there, the roll of bills heavy and useless in his hand. Her refusal was a slap in the face. It didn't prove her integrity to him. It only deepened the mystery, making him more certain than ever that she was hiding something far more valuable than pride. The town was a gallery of judging eyes. As Alara made her slow, deliberate way to the mercantile, she could feel them on her back, hot and sharp. The whispers were the soundtrack to her daily life, a chorus of disapproval. Look at her, not an ounce of shame. The devil finds work for idle hands, and she's found his business, it seems. Mr. Blackwood offered her help, you know, real charity, and she threw it back in his face. Prideful, that one. The words were meant to be heard, tiny barbs designed to pierce her composure. She had learned to build a wall inside her mind, a place to retreat where their voices couldn't reach. But sometimes, a word, a tone, would slip through a crack and slice deep. Today, it was the word prideful. The seamstress, Mrs. Gable, had said it with such venom. Her lips pursed into a knot of righteousness. Pride. Was that what it was? She thought of him, of Liam, and a wave of dizziness washed over her. She leaned against the rough-hewn wall of the blacksmith's shop, closing her eyes, and the present dissolved. The smell of coal dust and scorched iron faded, replaced by the scent of pine needles and damp earth. It was night. A sliver of moon hung in the sky, a hook of bone. She was standing in a clearing, her hand in his. Liam. His face was all sharp angles and earnest intensity, illuminated by the soft moonlight. He was younger than her brother, but in that moment, he seemed ancient with purpose. "You don't have to do this, Ilara," he had whispered, his voice tight with a desperate hope. "We can just go, all three of us. We can disappear." She had looked from his face to the locket in his hand, the one with the tiny portrait of Lydia Blackwood inside. Lydia, the woman he loved, the woman trapped in a gilded cage on a hill. "She won't leave him," Ilara had said, her own voice flat with a certainty that broke his heart. "She's afraid. She loves me," Liam insisted, his grip tightening on her hand. "That's not always enough," Ilara had replied, her words a prophecy she didn't know she was making. "He'll destroy you, Liam. He'll crush you." The memory fractured, the image of his hopeful, doomed face shattering like glass. She opened her eyes, the blacksmith's hammer ringing like a funeral bell in the sudden return to the present. The townspeople were still watching. Her pride wasn't for herself. It was for him. It was all she had left of him. She would not let this town, or Silas Blackwood, diminish the memory of her brother's love, no matter how tragic, no matter how forbidden. She straightened up, her hand on her belly, a silent promise to the life within her, and the life that had been stolen. She would not bend. She would not break. She would not explain. Her grief was her own, a private, sacred country to which they would never be granted a visa. The St. Jude's Home for the Unwanted was less a building, and more a collection of weary planks and shingles clinging to a desperate idea of shelter. It smelled of damp wool, boiled cabbage, and the faint, sweet scent of childish sorrow. The matron, Mrs. Gable, was a woman whose stern demeanor was a thin crust over a deep well of desperation. She saw Ilara's daily pot of stew not as charity, but as a stay of execution against the hunger that was a constant gnawing wolf at the orphanage's door. "You shouldn't," Mrs. Gable would say every day, her voice gruff. And every day Ilara would reply, "They're hungry." Today, the exchange felt heavier. A cold wind rattled the window panes, a harbinger of the coming winter. The children were quieter, their small bodies huddled together for warmth. One of them, a small boy named Thomas with eyes the color of a stormy sea, sat apart from the others, staring at the floor. He hadn't spoken since he'd arrived 2 months prior. Ilara ladled a bowl of stew and brought it to him, sitting on the dusty floor beside him. She didn't speak, didn't coax. She simply sat, a silent companion in his world of silence. After a few minutes, he picked up the spoon and began to eat, his gaze never leaving the floor. He reminded her so much of Liam after their father had passed, the same retreat into a place no one else could enter. A dull ache started in her lower back, a constant companion these last few weeks. The weight of the child was pressing down, a constant reminder of the life she was sworn to protect and the life she had failed to. As she was leaving, a buggy pulled up. It was Dr. Adams, the town's only physician, a man whose gruffness was legendary but whose kindness was a poorly kept secret. He nodded at her, his eyes taking in her pallor, the slight sheen of sweat on her brow, and the way she held her back. "You're pushing yourself too hard, girl," he said, his voice raspy. "That child you're carrying needs a mother who isn't run ragged. This town, it's not kind to lone women." He looked from her to the dilapidated orphanage. "And that man on the hill," he continued, lowering his voice. "Silas Blackwood. He's a man hollowed out by grief. A hollow thing is dangerous. It tries to fill itself with whatever's nearest. Be careful." Ilara merely nodded, the ache in her back intensifying. "I'm fine, doctor." "No, you're not," he countered bluntly. "You're strong, I'll give you that. Strongest woman I've ever met. But even the strongest tree can be brought down by a steady wind. And a storm is coming, Ilara. I can feel it in my bones." He was right. She could feel it too. It wasn't just the change in the weather. It was a pressure building in the air, a tightening in her own body, a sense that the quiet war she had been waging was about to erupt into open conflict. The doctor's warning about Silas Blackwood echoed in her mind. A hollow thing. She had seen the emptiness in his eyes. She just hadn't realized how much he might crave to fill it with her ruin. Silas Blackwood was not a man accustomed to being denied. Ilara's quiet defiance was a splinter under his skin, a constant irritant. Her refusal of his money, her impenetrable calm. It all pointed to a larger narrative he couldn't yet read. So he did what he always did when faced with an obstacle. He brought his considerable resources to bear upon it. He rode into town and went to the sheriff's office, the room suddenly seeming small and shabby in his presence. Sheriff Miller, a man who owed his position to Blackwood's influence, was quick to offer his chair and his full attention. "Sheriff," Silas began, his voice devoid of pleasantries, "that woman, the pregnant one, Ilara, I want to know where she came from." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. "Well, Mr. Blackwood, she ain't broken no laws. She keeps to herself." "I don't care," Silas cut in, his voice like ice. "Check the records in the neighboring counties. Look for arrivals on the stagecoach over the last 6 months. Look for any mention of a woman matching her description. Look for the name Liam." The sheriff's eyes widened slightly at the mention of a specific name. "Liam, sir? Just look," Silas commanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. He left the office, leaving the sheriff scrambling to comply. His investigation was not born of idle curiosity. It was an old wound, weeping. As he rode back towards his empty monument of a home, the past rose up to meet him, as it always did. He saw Lydia, his late wife, not the distant, sad woman she had become in the end, but the vibrant girl he had married. He remembered her laughter, a sound he hadn't heard in his house for years. Then the memory soured as it always did. He saw her growing quiet, distant. He remembered finding the letters, hidden in a hatbox at the back of her wardrobe. Letters from a man named Liam, filled with a poetic, desperate love that Silas had never been able to offer her. The words had burned into his memory, words of escape, of a shared future far from him, far from the valley. He had confronted her, not with rage, but with a cold, wounded pride. She had denied everything, her eyes wide with a terror he had mistaken for guilt. He had tightened his grip, not with his hands, but with his wealth, his influence, ensuring she could never leave. He thought he was protecting his marriage, his honor. Instead, he had built a prison around the woman he loved. A few months later, she was gone. Taken by a sudden illness the doctor had called a broken heart. He had found a small, silver locket clutched in her hand, a locket he had never seen before. He had buried it with her, unable to bear the sight of it. Now, this woman, Ilara, appears, quiet, defiant, and with the same shadow of profound sorrow in her eyes that he had seen in Lydia's final months. The name Liam felt like a key. He was certain that if he could find the lock it fit, he would finally understand the architecture of his own ruin. The sky had been a bruised purple for days, heavy and ominous. Then the storm broke. It came not with a gentle warning, but with a violent, sudden fury, as if the heavens themselves were purging a great anger. Rain fell in solid, wind-driven sheets, turning the dusty streets of the town into churning rivers of mud. Thunder cracked overhead, a sound so visceral it shook the very foundations of the St. Jude's home. Inside, chaos was a rising tide. The old roof, patched and repatched over years of neglect, finally surrendered. Water began to pour through a dozen new leaks, dripping onto the thin blankets and the scared, upturned faces of the children. Mrs. Gable ran from leak to leak with buckets and pans, her stern facade washed away by sheer panic. Ilara, her own body a vessel of aches and imminent turmoil, moved with a surprising, focused grace. She gathered the youngest children, leading them to the driest corner of the main room, speaking to them in a low, soothing voice that cut through the cacophony of the storm. She used her own shawl to block a draft from a shattered window pane, her movements efficient and selfless. The storm was a physical manifestation of the turmoil inside her, yet in the face of the real, tangible crisis, her own pain was relegated to the background. From his fortress on the hill, Silas watched the storm assault the valley. His house was impervious, the stone walls and slate roof mocking the wind's rage. He watched the lights of the town flicker and die, plunging everything into a primal darkness. But one light remained, a single bobbing lantern in the direction of the orphanage. He could picture the scene inside, the leaks, the fear, the cold. He thought of the woman, Ilara, heavy with child, likely working to protect the very children the town had forsaken. Dr. Adams's words came back to him. A hollow thing is dangerous. It tries to fill itself with whatever's nearest. Was that him? Was his suspicion just a way to fill the emptiness Lydia had left behind? A strange feeling, one he hadn't felt in years, stirred within him. It was not pity. It was something closer to shame. He was a king in a stone castle, watching his most vulnerable subjects drown. Without another thought, he strode to his stables, his purpose clear. Half an hour later, 2 wagons, laden with dry blankets, lanterns, and canvas tarps, pulled up to the orphanage, guided by Silas himself. He and 2 of his ranch hands entered the sodden building, their presence shifting the atmosphere from one of panic to stunned silence. He didn't speak to Alara, didn't even look at her directly. He simply started giving orders, his voice a low rumble beneath the storm. Get those tarps on the roof. Get these blankets to the children. Start a fire in the main hearth. For the first time, his power was not a weapon of intimidation, but a tool of rescue. Alara watched him, her hand on her belly, her suspicion warring with a nascent, unwelcome flicker of gratitude. This act of grace felt as sudden and violent as the storm itself, and she didn't know if she could trust it. The dawn that followed the storm was pristine and quiet. The world seemed washed clean, the air crisp and smelling of wet earth and pine. The immediate crisis at the orphanage had passed, leaving behind a scene of muddy, organized chaos. Silas's ranch hands were already on the roof, hammering new shingles into place, the rhythmic sounds a promise of repair. Children, wrapped in thick wool blankets from the Blackwood Ranch, played in the pale morning sun. In the midst of the cleanup, one of the older boys, Thomas, the quiet one, came running to Mrs. Gable. He held something small and glinting in his palm. "Found it," he whispered, one of the first words he had spoken in months. "In the mud, near where the bread angel was." It was a small silver locket, tarnished and caked with dirt. It was oval-shaped, intricately engraved with vines. Mrs. Gable took it, assuming it must have been dropped by one of the ranch hands. When Silas came to inspect the work, she held it out to him. "One of your men might have lost this." Silas froze. His breath caught in his chest. He knew that locket. He knew the weight of it, the feel of the clasp, the pattern of the vines. He had not seen it in 5 years, not since the day he had laid his wife to rest, but he would have recognized it anywhere. His hand trembled slightly as he took it from her. With a click that echoed like a gunshot in the quiet morning, he opened it. On one side, as he knew it would be, was the tiny, faded portrait of his wife, Lydia, her smile painfully beautiful. On the other side, the side he had never been able to bring himself to look at before, was a photograph of a young man with intense, hopeful eyes and a familiar, angular face. It was Liam. All the air went out of Silas's lungs. The carefully constructed dam of his grief and control shattered into a million pieces. The shame he had felt during the storm was incinerated by a white-hot rage. He spun around, his eyes locking on Alara, who was sitting on the porch steps, resting. He strode towards her, the locket held out in his hand like a weapon. "This," he snarled, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "This is yours." Alara looked at the locket, and all the color drained from her face. "You brought this here," he accused, his voice rising, thick with years of repressed pain. "You came to this town. You played the saint. All to torment me. To what? Extort me? To remind me of the man who destroyed my life, who destroyed my wife." He was shaking, the locket a burning brand in his palm. "Who are you to him? Who are you to her? Tell me the truth." His accusation hung in the air, brutal and absolute, pinning her in place. The entire world seemed to shrink to the space between them, charged with a grief so powerful, it threatened to consume them both. The raw, agonizing fury in Silas's voice stripped away the last of Alara's defenses. The wall she had so carefully constructed crumbled to dust, leaving her exposed and trembling, not with fear, but with a sorrow as vast and deep as his own. She looked from the locket in his hand to his grief-ravaged face, and she knew the time for silence was over. The truth, in all its brutal complexity, had to be told. "He was my brother," she said, her voice barely a whisper, yet it cut through the morning air with the clarity of a bell. Silas stared at her, his rage faltering, replaced by a stunned confusion. "Your brother?" "His name was Liam," she continued, her gaze turning inward, to the landscape of her memory. "He was a good man. He wasn't a villain who destroyed your life, Mr. Blackwood. He was a boy who fell in love with a woman who was desperately unhappy. She finally met his eyes, and he saw not deception, but a profound, shared pain. Lydia loved him. She was suffocating in the life you had built for her. Not a life of love, but a life of possession. He didn't steal her from you. Her heart had already left long before she ever met my brother. They were going to leave together, not to hurt you, but to find a scrap of happiness for themselves. A tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. But I was afraid for him. I told him you were a powerful man, that you would crush him. On the night they were supposed to meet, I tried to stop him. We argued. He left, angry. There was an accident on the road, a runaway carriage. He was killed. The words came out, each one a stone she had carried for years, and now she was laying them down at his feet. Lydia waited for him, but he never came. When she heard the news, something inside her broke. She returned to you, to her gilded cage, and she carried her own secret. She was pregnant, Mr. Blackwood. When she died with my brother's child inside her. The confession settled in the space between them, heavy and devastating. Silas staggered back as if she had physically struck him. The narrative of his life, his wife's betrayal, his righteous anger, had been a lie. He had not been the victim. He had been the jailer. "Why did you come here?" he asked, his voice hollow, broken. "To be near the only family I had left," she said, her hand going to her own swollen belly. "To be near the place where my brother died. To be near the grave of the nephew I never got to meet." She looked down. "The baby I carry. His father was a kind man, a farmhand. He died of a fever before he even knew. I am alone. I feed these children because I know what it is to be unwanted. It is my penance. For my anger, for my bitterness, for failing to save my brother, for all the ghosts." The weight of her confession, the final release of a burden carried for so long, was too much for her weary body to bear. As the last word left her lips, a sharp, undeniable cramp seized her, radiating from her lower back and tightening across her abdomen, like an iron band. A soft gasp escaped her. She pressed a hand to her belly, her eyes wide with a new kind of alarm. Silas, still reeling from the tectonic shift in his understanding of the world, was jolted back to the present by her cry of pain. He saw the sweat bead on her forehead, the sudden, stark pallor of her skin. Another contraction gripped her, more intense this time, forcing a low groan from deep in her chest. The storm that had passed through the valley was now raging inside her. "The baby," she breathed, her voice strained. "It's too soon." Panic, a raw and unfamiliar emotion for Silas, seized him. He looked around wildly. The doctor was miles away in town, the road still thick with mud. The ranch hand stared, useless and frozen. Mrs. Gable rushed forward, her face a mask of concern. "We need to get her inside, now." Together they helped Alara to her feet, her legs trembling beneath her. They half-carried her into the orphanage, into a small, clean room that had been spared the worst of the storm's damage, and laid her on a narrow cot. The birth was coming, with the same untamable force as the storm, and they were utterly unprepared. All of Silas Blackwood's wealth, all his land, all his power was meaningless. His money couldn't stop the contractions. His influence couldn't summon a doctor from the ether. He was stripped bare, reduced to nothing more than a man in a room with a woman in labor. He was terrified. The ghosts of Lydia and the child he never knew, the child he now understood was never his, swirled around him, their phantom cries mixing with Alara's pained breaths. For a moment he was paralyzed by the suffocating weight of his past failures. But then he looked at Alara, at her face, contorted in pain but also fierce with determination, and something inside him broke free. This was not the past. This was happening now. A new life was fighting its way into the world, a life born not of his tragedy, but of Alara's own story of love and loss. Guided by Mrs. Gable's frantic but steady instructions, he found himself acting. He fetched clean water. He held Alara's hand, his grip firm, a silent anchor in her sea of pain. The room was small, humble, the air thick with tension and the primal scent of birth. Hours blurred together, each moment punctuated by a wave of pain and a shared, desperate effort. It was a crucible, burning away years of his pride, his anger, and her isolation. And then, as the first rays of the afternoon sun streamed through the window, a new sound cut through the air. A thin, reedy, but powerful cry. The cry of a newborn. A daughter. The storm was over. Outside the small window of the orphanage room, the world was drenched in the clean, golden light of a new day. Inside, the silence was soft and profound, broken only by the gentle breathing of Alara and the occasional soft snuffle from the tiny bundle wrapped in a clean wool blanket beside her. She had a daughter. A small, perfect life arrived in the heart of chaos, a symbol of impossible hope. Alara was exhausted, washed clean by the ordeal, but a quiet, fierce joy shone in her eyes as she looked at her child. Silas sat in a wooden chair by the cot, a position he had not left for hours. He had not slept. He had simply watched. The rigid, hard lines of his face softened into something new, something vulnerable. The man who had entered the orphanage consumed by rage and suspicion was gone, replaced by a man humbled by the raw, undeniable miracle of birth and the devastating weight of the truth. The ghosts had receded. In the cry of Alara's daughter, he had not heard an echo of his loss, but the sound of a beginning. He looked at Alara, at the deep weariness and the deeper strength in her face. The need to apologize was a physical ache in his chest. "Alara," he began, his voice rough with unshed tears and lack of sleep. He didn't have the words. Sorry felt too small, a pebble tossed into an ocean of wrongdoing. She simply looked at him, her gaze clear and without condemnation. She understood. She had lived in her own country of grief for so long. She recognized a fellow citizen. "I was wrong," he finally managed, the admission costing him the last of his pride. "About everything, about you, about Lydia, about Liam. I was a fool, blinded by my own pain." He looked at the baby, her tiny hand curled around Alara's finger. "I built a prison for my wife and called it a home. I let my grief curdle into something ugly. I am sorry." A single tear escaped and traced a path down his weathered cheek. "You don't have to be alone," he said, the offer tentative, fragile. "Either of you. My house is large, it's empty." It was not a proposition of power, but a plea against loneliness. He wasn't offering her a gilded cage, but a sanctuary. "Let me help you," he continued, his voice gaining a quiet strength. "Let me rebuild this place properly, for the children, in memory of them, of Lydia and of Liam, and for the child they never had." It was an offering, a penance, an act of creation to balance so many years of destruction. Alara looked at him, and for the first time she saw not the wealthy rancher, not the threat, but simply a man, as broken and as hopeful as she was. A slow smile touched her lips. Later, as Alara slept, Silas carefully lifted the baby from the crook of her arm. He held the tiny, warm weight against his chest, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle. He looked down at the sleeping infant, a new life untouched by the sorrows that had shaped them all. The vast, empty spaces in his life, in his heart, in his sprawling, silent house did not disappear, but for the first time, they felt as if one day they could be filled. The cycle of grief had been broken, not by vengeance or forgetting, but by the arrival of an unexpected, fragile grace.